This allows us to kind of cast sort of two different kind of types of environmental economics. You have sort of the main just kind of environmental economics, which has been mostly what we've talked about up to this point. This sort of considers the interactions between economic systems and the environment, and then kind of looks at the policies and how the policies affect those relationships. It really focuses mainly on the costs and benefits of environmental policy, and tries to ascertain what would be the most cost-effective way of dealing with environmental damage. Ecological economics takes a far less anthropocentric view of these issues and considers things like biodiversity, conservation, environmental justice, sustainability, far more than just sort of traditional environmental economics. In fact, environmental economics is really kind of seen as that middle ground between the environment and business interests, where ecological economics is really sort of a little bit more on the environmental side. And so that kind of creates an interesting set of frictions between environmental economists and ecological economists. This is, again, something that we'll talk about a little bit on class on June 4th. But the fact is that we will in this class sort of use a mixture of these two. Increasingly so, environmental economists are looking at ecological economists and sort of bringing that research into their own, and the same is true vice versa. And so kind of modern environmental economics courses sort of straddle the line between environmental economics and ecological economics, and this is great because it allows us to talk about a lot more interesting things, and also to suggest that even if we do take on a strict ecological view of these systems, that economic markets still can play a prominent and important role in achieving our desired goals. Another paper that you're going to read prior to class on June 4th is this idea of sustainability and what it is. Here we have sort of three basic definitions: weak, strong, and then sort of the highest level of sustainability, sustainable development. The idea here is that it depends on how you view capital. We have natural capital. These are natural resources: oil, water, natural gas, those types of things. And then physical capital, machines, and the things that we take natural capital and turn it into, things like physical capital, trucks and machines and tools that we take from natural capital and then kind of turn into physical capital. Weak sustainability would essentially assume that physical and natural capital are substitutable with each other. In other words, that if I draw down natural capital, as long as I'm increasing physical capital to offset the drawdown in natural capital, then I'm still being sustainable. This view believes that you can, in fact, one-for-one trade off natural capital with physical capital. This clearly is weakly sustainable in the sense that typically when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about natural capital, right? We're thinking about the water issues, the air issues, the biodiversity issues, the resource issues, when we think about natural capital. And as we draw the stock of natural capital down, even if we're accentuating physical capital, that there's this sort of difference between physical and natural capital that means they're not really substitutable for each other. In other words, is it really the case that if I cut down a forest to make paper, that's a one-for-one trade-off? Right, that I'm just as happy as I was prior to the forest being cut down than I was after the forest is being cut down. If it's the case that isn't true, that in fact there is differences between natural and physical capital, then we move into more of a strong sustainability world in which the goal is to actually maintain total capital over time, but you cannot substitute natural and physical capital. In other words, you either have to leave natural capital at its current rate and grow physical capital somehow, or if you are going to draw down natural capital, you have to reinvigorate it at some point later. And that's something that we'll talk about as well. It is completely possible for a country to draw down natural capital and then later build it back up. A great example of this is deforestation. So in the 1900s, the U.S. Just tore down huge swaths of its forest resource. But then in the 60s and 70s and all the way through today, conservation projects were undertaken to the extent that we were actually able to build back up the stock of trees, to the extent that we actually have more trees today than we had trees back at the beginning of the 1900s. So in a sense, we've reversed that deforestation. So that's possible as well. Of course, there are forms of natural capital that cannot be grown back. Oil, natural gas, your non-renewable resources cannot be grown back. And so once you're using those, you are sort of reducing your natural capital in that context. And so it makes the ability to be strong, sustainable, very difficult. And then lastly, we have sustainable development. This is the augmenting of total capital over time, meaning, and then assuming that you can't substitute natural and physical capital. So not only are you maintaining capital, you're actually growing capital, and you're doing so in a way in which you're not drawing down natural capital at all, or you're growing it back, as we said before. Oftentimes we define sustainable development as actually taking your economic system and growing it in a way that in fact infuses sustainability. A good example of this would be if the U.S. economy were to become more reliant upon wind and solar energy for things like job growth. So over the last 15 years, there's been a tremendous amount of job growth in wind and solar energy industries in the U.S. At the same time, there's also been, or there was at least, considerable job growth in oil and natural gas extraction as well. And so that, of course, lacks a little bit of sustainability because we're drawing down natural capital in that context. So sustainable development would be, in fact, if instead of growing jobs in oil and natural gas, that job growth was simply added on to the job growth in wind and solar energy industries, for example. That would be sustainable development. So you actually grow your economy by becoming more sustainable. So fewer coal and natural gas jobs, completely offset by more, solar and wind energy jobs, or geothermal, or nuclear, or whatever the cleaner fuel source is, as opposed to, say, fossil fuels. That sort of trade-off would be considered a sustainable development move. And the nice thing is that some countries have actually sort of moved in this direction a little bit. The U.S. did so for a little while, but we're kind of backtracking a little bit with the current administration in terms of sustainable development. The other important part about sustainable development is that many countries have what we call sustainable development goals. In other words, they actually have metrics that they look at in terms of whether they are either becoming more or less sustainable. And this has really assisted countries, again, in having those policy discussions about how much they should be concerned about the environmental impact of their economic growth. And we've seen that sustainable development goals chartered by the UN, for example, also by the European Union, and individually countries are coming up with their own forms of sustainable development. And so that's very promising and something very much to be optimistic about. Whether countries actually achieve sustainable development remains to be seen, but the fact that countries are trying to achieve sustainable development is certainly something we should feel good about. One of the kind of more interesting aspects of environmental protection is that, in fact, it's correlated with increases in economic growth. So after all that we've said in this lecture, all that I've said in this lecture with respect to the impact of economic growth on environmental protection, the fact is that if you look at data, the countries that actually are able to lower their environmental degradation are the rich countries. And this is just one of those interesting things where countries grow themselves over time. As they grow themselves, they achieve higher levels of education, they achieve higher levels of wealth, and it's that sort of combination of education and wealth which then creates policy pressure that is applied to politicians to actually protect the environment. So in this particular graph, you can see that as we go through stages of development from pre-industrial economies, so agricultural economies are increasing their emissions and environmental degradation to grow the economy. Then we reach an industrial stage in which environmental degradation continues to increase. But then as we get towards the tail end of the industrial stage and then to what we call post-industrial stage, we see economic systems that achieve a certain amount of wealth transition into service sector economies. So they go from being industrial economies, largely centered around producing stuff. So think about the early 1900s in the U.S. economy, where the economy is defined by steel manufacturing, coal extraction, railroads, things we talked about previously, and then think about the U.S. economy as it exists today in the modern era. We are a 70% service sector economy. 70% of economic growth in the United States is based upon services. Okay, that transition from an industrial sector economy to a service sector economy also correlates with a reduction in environmental degradation. And we call this the environmental Kuznets curve. And it basically says is that as economy grows itself, it will at first degrade its environment in increasing amounts, and then at a certain point it will achieve what we call a turning point. It will achieve an amount of economic wealth that will allow it to actually start to reverse or reduce its environmental degradation. And we see environmental Kuznets curves for different types of pollutants as well. There are countries who show environmental Kuznets curves for things like sulfur dioxide, environmental Kuznets curves for deforestation, environmental Kuznets curves for CO2. In fact, in class we'll discuss a paper that I've written with a couple co-authors of myself, where we actually estimate environmental Kuznets curves for both the U.S. and China with respect to CO2 emissions, and we show that in fact both the U.S. and China seem to have this inverted U-shape to their CO2 emissions, which would indicate perhaps an environmental Kuznets curve. But the interesting thing here is that this suggests, in fact, that the way that a country reduces environmental damage is by at first increasing environmental damage to achieve a level of economic wealth that then allows it to enlighten itself to the extent that later on it actually reduces environmental degradation. To the environmentalists out there, this is probably not the most satisfying conclusion, given that you have to churn up your environment before you actually start to save it. But to an economist, this is not surprising at all. The fact is that poor countries and countries that are still developing, the citizens therein have concerns that really go beyond the environment. They're concerned about things far beyond just whether, for example, a particular species of animal is being conserved. It isn't until a country achieves a certain level of wealth that people are really given the space to consider environmental issues alongside their own personal issues. And so this isn't a criticism of developing economies. In fact, it's more of to point out that there's this opportunity for developing economies, that even if economies right now are growing themselves and degrading their environment, that there is sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, that once you achieve a certain level of wealth, we'll actually see a reduction in environmental degradation. And under kind of this theory, the goal should be for countries to help other countries grow themselves. So those countries who have already found out how to reduce their environmental degradation, they should help developing countries grow, so those countries can now see the downward trend on their environmental Kuznets curve. All right, and lastly, I want to talk about two sort of particular frameworks to think about these particular issues. The first one is Hartwick's rule, which is with respect to intergenerational equity. What Hartwick and then Robert Solow, also part of this research, said is that the gains from resource use or resource extraction, in other words, as we pull oil, natural gas, iron ore out of the ground, what we should do is we should invest the profits from that to offset the reduction in standard of living that might arise from resource use. So basically, if we're going to pull oil out of the ground, we should use the profits from oil to invest in non-fossil fuel technology so that eventually we can move ourselves off of oil. And so the basic argument is that if we're going to use oil today, all right, this means that there's going to be less oil that can be used in the future by future generations. So we either don't use oil today, so oil can be used in the future, or we use oil today, but we offset that reduction in the resource stock by investing in alternative forms of energy. So if you're going to have an oil company that makes a bunch of profits on oil extraction, from a social perspective, then what we should want that company to do is then use those profits to invest in non-fossil fuel energy use in the future. This would achieve a certain level of intergenerational equity. The other issue with Hartwick's rule is that it says something about how much resource we consume in the current generation relative to how much resources we'll be able to use in the future generation. And again, because humans are myopic, because we're short-sighted, we do not tend to think about future generations when we make economic decisions, when we make economic policy, when we make environmental policy, in fact. And so Hartwick's rule really gives us, again, another framework for us to understand what might potentially be a more sustainable solution to our current resource extraction. And then lastly, I've already talked about the veil of ignorance, but I want to kind of leave on this particular topic. So John Rawls comes up with the veil of ignorance, and again it says that decisions should be made as if no one knows where they fit in the economic system. Thomas Malthus actually was the first economist to point out that environmental degradation falls most heavily on those individuals who are least able to help themselves. So the poorest among us are almost always going to be the most negatively impacted by environmental degradation. And again, this is an issue that Thomas Malthus is talking about at the tail end of the 18th century, in the late 1700s. So it's been around for a very long time. So the equity issues inside of economic systems are not merely about wealth. The equity issues inside economic systems are also about the extent to which poor individuals face environmental degradation. So if we use Rawls's veil of ignorance, the idea that I don't know who I'm going to be in the economic system, therefore the policies that I support will be the policies that are best for everybody, then this would suggest that the issue of environmental degradation is not merely about the environment. It's not merely about the economy, but this is about other humans as well. And that reducing environmental degradation, if environmental degradation, in fact, does fall most heavily, as it does, on low-income individuals, then by reducing environmental degradation, not only are we saving the environment, but we're also lifting the burden off of those individuals who are already burdened by our economic system. So what we've really laid out here in this first lecture is that environmental economics attempts to make environmental protection arguments not just with respect to a moral consideration, not simply with respect to an equitable consideration, but perhaps most importantly, from an economic consideration. And the way in which we frame these issues, be it from an equity issue or just from an environmental issue or whether it's from an economic issue, the fact is that each of those creates incentives for us to reduce our current level of environmental degradation. And so the question is really, within this class, how now do we think about different types of environmental issues, whether it's different types of pollution or different types of resource extraction or different types of climate issues, for example? How do we frame our economic system within those particular considerations so as to achieve not only a more equitable economy, not only a less environmentally damaging economy, but also an economy that will continue to grow?